in a clean and pure nation. Marcus Garvey talked about us as a nation. He talked about nationalism. There were men prior to them who spoke about nationality. Edward Wilmot Blyden was one of the first ones to talk about nationality and said that we have to have a distinct nationality, right? However, Noble Drew Ali is the first one to actually pinpoint what nationality we should proclaim.
Okay, that's probably what should have been my question. As it pertains to nationality, what would be the distinct factor of what Noble Drew Ali brought us as compared to his predecessors? What distinguished him from? Because, like you said, you even had many people in the Pan-African. Brother Simran, laid that, laid that down. Henry Highland Garnett, I believe he came a little bit before Noble Drew Ali. So what was distinctive about what Noble Drew Ali brought us as compared to those before us on that topic?
Yes, and as I mentioned, what he brought that was distinctive was the fact he specified the nationality.
Okay.
Never before did they specify the nationality that we as a people should proclaim and take on for ourselves. And also, what he also did with that, because remember I said that according to law, nationality determines political status, he was able to mobilize the members of his organization through nationality, politically, right? One of the things he did, and I think we mentioned this in the last interview, was that he was able to mobilize the Moorish Americans in Chicago, which allowed them to bring into office Oscar DePriest as the first congressman recognized in history, as they say, the first African-American congressman since Reconstruction. And keep in mind, this is 30 years, 3 decades before the Civil Rights Movement, before Dr. King and all of them. He was able to do that. He also traveled to Cuba for the Pan American Conference, and there's records of that, which is historic, because you have a man who by all intents and purposes, according to society, was just an average man, and he was, to them, they wanted to attribute him to a low class of people because the people was called Negro, Black, Color, et cetera, and they attached certain things to those titles. This man, through his nationality, by proclaiming his nationality and creating his political status, was able to go to a political conference and be amongst other heads of state. And in there was a record that was produced called the Bustamante Code. And that particular code dealt with nationality, right? And that's why, even to this day, many of our brothers and sisters in places like Cuba and etc., they know the importance of the Moors. They know the importance of nationality. If you talk to our, for lack of a better word, our Spanish-speaking brothers and sisters down in those countries, and you tell them that you're a Moor, they'll automatically identify with you. So nationality is what he was able to do with nationality just in the little time span that he was with us, has left a legacy to this day, to the fact that me and you, after over 100 years, are still talking about not only him, but his movement, the movement that he founded for us. So.
And is that still different from Marcus Garvey saying African for the Africans? Because some would say, well, Marcus Garvey, did the same thing. He said Africans. Would that be along the same line, or is that still different?
Well, it plays into it. African for the Africans dealt with specifically, and Brother Simran could probably expound on it, us identifying with a landmass, the continent of Africa. It said Africans home and abroad. Right? So it was, remember that time, Africa, the continent of Africa, was under colonization. So what Marcus Garvey did, or what he taught or promoted, was the fact that that land was supposed to be for us, our people, which is a noble thing. There's a distinction between saying that the land of our ancient forefathers is our own, which we all know and we all respect and honor, and saying that I am of this nationality, and through this nationality I am now amongst the family of nations. Because what that does now, from a political standpoint, it now puts you at the table. Okay, I'll give you an example. During the time before the UN, the United Nations, there was what's known as the League of Nations. Okay, and there was, I believe it was, and someone here can correct me if I'm wrong, W.E.B. Du Bois was invited to come to the United Nations. Okay. Right? And the representatives of Japan got up and walked out. And you know what they basically said, and I'm paraphrasing? They said, so why would you bring a slave here? And keep in mind, W.E.B. Du Bois identified himself as Negro and colored. Right? His organization is NAACP. Right? That opens up, because that was co-founded by some people of European descent as well, but that's a whole nother subject.
That stands for Negroes always asking Caucasian permission, right?
Pretty much.
All right.
Right?
Right.
But again, we have to realize that with that in and of itself, what he didn't realize, and what a lot of people didn't realize, it was by virtue of the fact that he identified himself with a title that alludes to slavery. The title of colored, the title of Negro, title of black, title, all these things, they allude to slavery. How is that possible? I did a presentation earlier this year at the Stanford L. Warren Library. It was called Unrooted.
Right.
The True Origins of the African Slave Trade and
post-traumatic
PTSD, right? In there, I presented a chart. In that chart, you can actually pull up online through the census. It's dealing with the census. The census started in 1790, right? And it's a color-coded chart. And what it does is it explains what was the classifications of race, how they took you down and put you in the census. Do you know originally in 1790 there was only 3 classifications? You want to know what those classifications were?
I'm waiting to hear it.
Whites, slaves, and other free persons.
So color-wise, it was only one group of people. Because a slave, like what? I mean, we have all kind of colors of slaves.
So what that tells you is this: the white is a class,
not a color.
It's not a color. That's what it. And then I showed in the same chart the same color code. So let's say, I'm gonna give you the example just off the top of my head. I'm not sure if these are colors. Let's say white was codified as yellow, slave was blue, and other free persons was red. Let's just say hypothetically. As it came along, every 10 years, because the census happens every 10 years, it was a new term, but the color stayed the same. So the slaves now was no longer called slaves, they were called Negroes. And then it wasn't called Negroes, they were called coloreds. Then they were called blacks. Then they were called African American. You see what I'm saying? And then they may have introduced another one. You know, the entries multiplied, but it always stayed back to its original thing. So now when you hear Moors say that these titles allude to slavery, you know why, because we're talking about the codified law that connects to it. So now when you hear about a situation of W.E.B. Du Bois, identifying himself as a colored man. And Japanese people get up and walk out and say, why would you bring a slave to the League of Nations?
Now it's a clear picture.
It's a clear picture, as opposed to Noble Drew Ali, who identified himself as a Moorish American, his nationality, right? Even in here it says, he said, we're not Negroes. He goes to that Pan-African Congress and gets respected because nationality determines your political status. If you're void of a nationality, you're not looked at as having a political status. You're actually looked at as being property. And that's what the Dred Scott case was about. The Dred Scott case dealt with nationality because the question was asked, can the Negro of the African race, we talked about African, right? The Negro of the African race be considered a member of the free political community, basically a citizen. And it said that the Negro of the African race, keep that word, of the African race, the Negro can only be considered as property in the strictest sense. I'm paraphrasing, right? So now we're saying Negro of the African race. So if you're saying African race, if they use that, that's the term that they use. So they identifying that all people of the African race are not Negroes.
They made a distinction.
They made a distinction, and that's also made in the actual law, the Negro Law of South Carolina in 1848, in Chapter 1, verse Section 4, where it gave a definition of the word Negro, and it defined it as those who are those who enslaved Africans. And not to be confused, I'm paraphrasing, not to be confused with the free inhabitants of Africa. And you know what they listed amongst the free inhabitants of Africa? Moors.
Free.
So, free. So that's why Noble Drew Ali was saying what he was saying back in 1913, because he looked at the books, he looked at law and said, according to law, how you identify yourself determines how you're classified. So,
Yeah. Well, I think that's you just dropped some atomic bombs, brother. I think that's part of the sickness of black people, so to speak. Instead of us looking at it as he's building upon something, they looking at points of contention.
Right.
Well, Garvey actually said this and this, and he just built upon what Mr. Garvey, the way you explained it, he built upon and gave it more clarification and gave us more power. Another quick point about the census.
Yes,
and that was some bombs you was dropping on that. I wonder if you could give us in the audience a little clarification on what they did in 1973 with the census, which hardly no one, talks about. What you just delivered about the census, I'd never heard that before. How Hispanics was coming here, right, and the voting power, they were identifying themselves as African, and then this President Nixon, he comes along and says, oh no, they're not African, they're Hispanics. He made that term up to divide blacks, whatever you want to call yourself at that time, or Africans, and made up this, there's no such thing as Hispanics.
Right.
He made up that term in 73, in the 1973 census. So I wanted to know, can you connect that to the bombs you just dropped about the specification, how important that is, if you could give us.
Right, absolutely. Again, that goes all the way to, that ties right back to identity, because that also ties back to what I said, that race is a social construct. And not only is race a social construct, it's a codification, it's a classification. Because anybody here, you should look up Federal Directive 15. Federal Directive 15, which is a federal directive basically that defines race. So anytime you go and you get an application or anything that has that race box and tell you to check what race you are, Federal Directive 15 determines the definitions that are attached to those identities. So Hispanic, right, white, black, Asian, all of that. That's connected to Federal Directive 15. Is actually was put out there by the government agency known as the Office of Management Budget, which is also responsible for the census that I told you. So when you look up there and you look at the definitions connected to all of those, races, you'll see something interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Each one of those races, by definition, they'll have it in the definition national origin,
Mm-hmm.
except for one.
Mm-hmm.
You want to know which one of that is?
White.
Black.
Black. Mm-hmm.
Black is the only term amongst all the races that's listed in Federal Directive 15 that is not attached in their definition of national origin. When I said nationality is the order of the day,
Mm-hmm.
if you look at it, it'll say black racial groups of Africa, which doesn't even make sense.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
what I'm saying is that classification, what they did was shrewdly take you out of your nationality
Mm-hmm.
with that term, with these
Mm-hmm.
terms.
Mm-hmm.
They knew that these terms are not connected to a nation, it's not connected to a nationality, it's not connected to anything that they want you to have that gives you a political status.
Mm-hmm.
With Hispanics,
Mm-hmm.
with the term Hispanics, what they did was, knowing that we are all really with the same blood,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
They had to label that, right? And we know that there's amalgamation, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But the part is that our origins, we all share that as far as our brothers and sisters in those Central and South America.
Right.
We actually have a whole chapter in the Moorish Holy Quran here. And I just want to read it, if I may.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Which speaks about this. So this chapter, let's get to it right away. Chapter 45. Sorry. It says, the divine origin of the Asiatic nations. The fallen sons and daughters of the Asiatic nation of North America need to learn to love instead of hate, and to know of their higher self and lower self. This is the uniting of the Holy Quran of Mecca for teaching and instructing all Moorish Americans, etc. The key of civilization was and is in the hands of the Asiatic nations, the Moorish, who were the ancient Moabites and the founders of the holy city of Mecca. The Egyptians, who were the Hammatites and a direct descendant of Mesraim, the Arabians, the seed of Hagar, Japanese and Chinese, the Hindus of India, the descendants of ancient Canaanites, Hittites, and Moabites from the land of Canaan. The Asiatic nations and countries in North, South, and Central America. The Moorish Americans and Mexicans in North America, Brazilians, Argentinians, and Chileans in South America, Colombians, Nicaraguans, and the natives of San Salvador and Central America, etc. All of these are Muslims. Now I want to stop there. You know why that's so interesting? Because if you look at the history, if you look at the records of people like Cortez and other explorers, they will tell you that when they came down to these lands, they saw artifacts with Arabic writing in them. Many of the words in Spanish match Arabic words. Right? They will tell you that they were of Moorish descent. There's records that speak to that. So that goes back to what I mentioned about the Pan-American Conference. So to what you're saying, brother, yeah, it was a divide and conquer tactic.
Right.
Absolutely.
That's the point I wanted to get across, because they were coming here identifying, because you got like 2,000 different dialects in Africa. It's Africans that can speak better Spanish than, quote, Spanish people. And they were coming here identifying the point that, you know, the Moorish Science Temple, masterfully lays out about the importance of identification. They was identifying themselves as Africans. And they was like, that's too much power. They're going to join together and take over. Let me see what I can come up with to divide. And they come up with this term Hispanic. And I work in Durham public schools. I've worked with children, that have behavior problems, and a lot of them, they don't even know who they are. Now they got more organization than we do, but a lot of them, one minute they get mad if someone calls himself a Mexican and all that. Well, I'm Hispanic. They don't even know. It's a made up term.
Yeah.
It's a made up. There's no such thing. So I'm glad that our brother and those that came after him, that you're letting us know the importance of identification, because as it relates to law, I had no clue, about this. I want to give people a chance to ask questions, but I want to ask one more question, and we'll open up for question and answer, because we're already rolling up on an hour, and you barely even scratched the surface. That's how deep this stuff is. How did Noble Drew Ali get his members? Like, we have no Facebook, no Twitter, no Instagram, none of that stuff. And we often hear about how the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, he went into, the neighborhoods and he did this and that. How was he able to get all the members? Was he just mostly in Chicago and Newark? Were there other temples? And how did he?
Yes.
How was he able to do that at that time? That always was in my mind.
Well, to the second part of your question, yes, he had more than just Newark and Chicago.
Okay.
At the time when he was alive in the flesh, there were 15 different temples across the country.
Wow.
So
mostly on the East Coast?
All over.
All over.
There was temples in Virginia, Baltimore, Maryland, West Virginia, Arkansas.
Wow.
All throughout. Pittsburgh.
Wow.
All throughout. Philadelphia. All throughout. So he definitely traveled a lot. Of course, that would speak to that. But also importantly, what he was able to do is he was able to utilize the power of the press. I always say that. He produced a newspaper entitled Moorish Guide. And one interesting thing about Moorish Guide is that though it was primarily targeted towards members of his organization, the Moorish Science Temple of America, it also opened to other brothers and sisters as well, because many of the advertisements in the newspaper were from people who were not necessarily members. Okay. And there was also interaction. He interacted with a lot of different groups. We know about the Elks and other different groups of particularly influential people. Have you ever heard of Jesse Binga?
No.
Jesse Binga, if you ever look up Jesse Binga was a brother. He was a very prominent banker. He had the Binga Bank in Chicago. He was one of the most wealthiest men at the time. He had a relationship with Noble Drew Ali.
Matter of fact, black man?
Who you would call black?
Yeah.
Right. Yes. So there's actually a photograph with Noble Drew Ali and Jesse Binga, as well as with Oscar the Priest, who we just mentioned about, as well as other people in those in the realm of politics and economics.
Now you mentioned the press. Now, when he was traveling, give us a timeline, because a lot of my talks on the YouTube channel, which is called The Hour of Power, I often reference a book called Without Sanctuary, which is a 100-year documentation of lynchings from 1865 to 1965. I mean, they was making postcards. So it had to be a lot of tension at that time. So let's say he went to Pittsburgh. Did he go through the white press to I mean, like, how, I'm really intrigued, like, how did he do this without, opposition and being harmed?
He created his own.
And he was looking, he had his...
Just like
that.
Just like Marcus Garvey had the Negro World, right? Noble Drew Ali had the Moorish Guide. It was all about us. You have to keep in mind that one of the advantages, I would say, of what they call segregation was that we was able to do for ourselves. It was
had our own connections.
Had our own connections, exactly.
That's a good point.
So there was no need for him to go to anyone who was of European descent.
That's why timeline is so important.
You're talking from 1913 to 1929 when he passed form. You're talking about 1913 being the year in which he founded the inception of the Moorish Science Temple.
Did he go into prisons, get brothers like that, or?
Well, no, that wasn't his main thing as far as going into prison. He basically was primarily reaching the people out there. Matter of fact, many of the sisters the first, we use the term sheik and sheikhs. The first sheik was a sheikhess, Sister Sloan Bay.
Okay.
So the women played an important part. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that point. Even to this day, sisters play an important part in movements. We don't give the sisters enough credit, right? Because they are the mothers of civilization. They're the ones who teach our children. So if they're not put in the proper position of power, we won't move. It's not a one-sided thing. So the sisters played a major role.
So going into the prison system, that's something that was there any particular brother?
That came going into the prisons came down after he had passed form. That was introduced through a sheik by the name of R. German Bey.
Yeah, I like having names and references.
Yes,
R. German Bey. So he kind of started that engine going.
The prison ministry. Yes,
and you're involved. Are you still involved in the prison ministry here?
I still keep in contact. I'm not as active in the prison ministry as before, but we still get correspondence all the time from brothers in the prison system.
Right, and I'm sure our brother would be proud of you guys, doing that. But he laid the groundwork.
Yes, sir.
Is there anything else you want to add before we open it up for a question and answer? Anything else you want to add? Because we're already at an hour.
No, nothing other than I'm definitely enjoying this conversation.
Yes, it's deep.
I'm glad that we had it.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm open for anyone who won't have any questions or comments or anything at this time.
And again, for those who don't know, this is produced by the Hour of Power. It's my YouTube channel. You can go to Hour of Power Shareef Hameed, SHAREEF HAMEED on YouTube. And I will be transferring this message to the channel, and you can subscribe and share. I have all kind of different things we're doing on there. I try to reach the mind, body, and soul of our people, no matter what. And these wonderful brothers actually went with me on Holloway Street, which is one of the roughest streets here in Durham, North Carolina. Brothers and sisters, like a zombie land. Brothers and sisters up and down the street on drugs, and I reached out to the brothers here to help me go there, and it's not an easy thing. And this wonderful brother here and our brother in the back there assisted me, and it's a wonderful thing. So they deserve all the credit for that. But that's some of the things that we do on the channel. So finishing out, if anyone has any questions or comments for our wonderful brother here, let me know.
Yeah, I got a question.
Yes, sir.
Sister Grand Governor, could you break down when they call you black and African American? Could you break down the status between them two?
Okay. Well, really, according to the census, is really the same thing as far as what the connection it ties to. But African American was something that came down later, and it was promoted heavily by Jesse Jackson. So some people will say that the intent was to connect us to our heritage of our people in Africa, which is a good intention. Again, with nationality, you have to be specific. Even Edward Wilmot Blyden said that the nationality should be distinct. So Africa is not a nation, it's a continent that has over 50 nations, right? And I always give this analogy. Chinese people know their connection with the nation of China. They're not confused about that. Japanese, they won't say, I'm Far Eastern. And even when you say Asian American, they know that was something that was introduced by the European anyway. They're very distinct on their nationality, their flag, their history, and their culture. So that's always important that we have to keep in mind what we do as Moorish Americans. Yes.
So if you're speaking of nationality, what nationality are you talking about in terms of being a nation within us?
Right, and I'm glad you mentioned that. That's a very good question. So I think it's important that we make clear what determines nationality. Okay, so according to law, nationality is the quality and character that arises from one belonging to a nation, right? And as I mentioned earlier, it determines political status. Now, in nationality, there are 2 points of criteria that is used to determine one nationality. One is called, and I'll use the Latin words and I'll go to translation. One is called jus sanguinis, which is a Latin word which means right of blood, right? And the other one is jus soli, which means right of soil. So, in the Moorish questionnaire, the question is asked, what is your nationality? The answer is Moorish American. The next question that's asked is, why are we Moorish Americans? The answer is, because we are descendants of Moroccans and born in America. So that addresses 2 aspects. The right of blood, because we are descendants, because the right of blood is your heritage, your bloodline, your heritage. We're descendants of Moroccans and born in America. That establishes jus soli, the land, the right of the land. So we're on this land that is identified today as America. We're born here, but we are descendants of who we call Moroccans, which has an ancient name even before Moroccans. So Moroccans is just a modern name in and of itself. But for the purpose of conversation, that's what we say. So I hope that answered your question. If not, if you could kind of just.
No, but.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure.
So where do we stand then with the American flag? Because I see you have the American flag and you have
Yes.
the red flag with
Yes.
the 5
Moorish flag.
Moorish flag. Thank you.
Yes.
The 5 green, 5 pointed.
Star in the center.
Star,
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. And that ties exactly what I'm saying. This flag here is the Moorish flag, which is the flag that's connected to the right of blood. So this deals with our descendancy, right? As Moors, where we descendants of Moroccans, born in America. That's what they call the American flag, right? And again, we know, technically speaking, America is more than the United States. It consists of Canada, Mexico, etc., etc. So, but for the purpose of conversation, that is identified as the American flag. That is the reason why we have the flag, as well as this flag. In all nations, nationalities, when they deal from nation to nation, they will have their flag as well as the flag on the land in which the presiding government is in, to show that they're dealing nation to nation. So, you know, people may feel a certain way by seeing the flag because of their emotional concern about it, right? But we're dealing with